The Dharma, incomparably profound and exquisite, is rarely met with even in hundreds of thousands of millions of kalpas. We now can see it, hear it, accept and hold it. May we realize the true mind of the Tathagata. And of course, that is what our practice is about. It is realizing the truth of the fundamental perfection, the beyond words-ness of who and what we are. Many, many years ago, when I was fairly early on at the Rochester Zen Center, this is back in the 1970s, there was some concern because a young man in his 20s who was accepted to come and live and practice at the center had not shown up. Well, it turns out that he didn't show up because he had been murdered. I guess he'd been camping along the way on the edge of a lake, and whatever happened, and he did not get to come to the center to do his concentrated practice. And just recently, someone made a comment on one of the earlier teishos saying that their coworker at age 35 had died suddenly shoveling snow. The only person home was his 7-year-old son, who was unaware of the situation. When his wife came home from her late shift, she discovered his body covered with snow. The Tibetan Buddhist teachings urge us to recognize that the time of death is unknown. It could come soon, it could come late. Just recently, they pulled a 5-year-old Moroccan boy out of a well after several days of trying to dig him out, and he did not survive. And many, many years ago, friends of mine who were pregnant, expecting their first child, the baby died the day it was supposed to be born. Through some anomaly, as it dropped into the birth canal, it pressed against the umbilical cord and basically cut off the life stream. On the other side of the coin, we have the option to practice, but there are, for most people who come to practice, not everyone, but for most of us, it's very, very challenging. I have spoken of this before, but I first began Zen practice after having refused it 3 months prior. But in that intervening 3 months, every single thing I valued in my life disappeared. It just was, fell out from under me. There is something called a shamanic initiation. That was not what I had any information about at that time. I learned about it many, many decades later, where I say everything old is ripped away so the new can come forth. Sorry about that hiccup. Whatever it was, the internet shut down momentarily and immediately came back up with someone else as the lead. But I think we're back, and we can continue with the teisho. I mentioned that after refusing an invitation from somebody who wanted to teach me how to do Zazen, 3 months later, I was back on that person's doorstep asking for the instruction. I had lost everything, every single thing in my life that mattered to me, every single thing. It was devastating, and it was only because of that devastation and the recognition that killing myself was not something that I wanted to do that led me to go and ask for the instruction in Zazen. And it was not easy, not at all easy. I did practice Zazen on my own. I was living outside the country back then. And every time I sat on the cushion, I burst into tears because of the losses. Eventually, I went to a 4-day sesshin at the Rochester Zen Center. And it was a struggle just to try to focus my mind on this practice, even though it was simple, just counting my breaths. There was too much heaviness in my heart, too much confusion in my brain to really be able to do it very well. But I knew that that was the only way out from this incredibly pervasive suffering that I was experiencing. I had experienced a fair amount of suffering as I was growing up, but I'd stuffed it just simply to survive, as most people do when they experience trauma. And the only problem is that when we do Zazen, whatever is stuffed begins to leak out of whatever it's stuffed into. And that offers us this incredible opportunity to deal with it. At that point, many people simply quit practice. It seems like it's just not working. And actually, it really is. It takes a tremendous amount of courage to do Zazen if we have a history of, let's say, challenge. No matter what that challenge is. If we have a history in which we have chosen to, for very good reason, repress our experiences and how they felt. They might have been overwhelming at the time, and who wants to live in terror? Who wants to live in anguish? Who wants to live in profound depression? But as we do Zazen, if we have that kind of a history, and I hope I'm not scaring you, these things do come up. And if we are also in therapy at the time, which I realized finally I had to do when a fellow Zen practitioner at the Rochester Zen Center, we were all living and practicing at the center, and he was a psychiatrist. And at one point he offhandedly commented to me that he thought I had some repression going on. And indeed I did. That was the days when I would have headaches periodically, really bad headaches. And then one day I realized I wasn't having headaches all of a sudden. I was having gaps in the headache that I had had from countless years back, way back. I got my first migraine when I was 16. So the practice was quite difficult, quite difficult. But it was because I knew that there was no other way out. And for some reason, I also had a sense that if I did kill myself, which I realized also, besides the fact that I didn't want to, I didn't have the courage to do that, it wasn't going to gain anything. And now, deeper and deeper and deeper in my practice, I realize that it definitely won't gain anything except more negative experience, because the energy of that trauma, whatever it was, and the subsequent killing of oneself, which is a greater trauma, will reverberate through lifetimes. And you'll have not only whatever was going on that made you choose to commit suicide, but you'll also have the fallout from it. Not to mention creating tremendous pain to family and friends. So what do you do when you're between a rock and a hard place? This understanding that death could come at any point in time, and the Buddha himself recognized that as he was going so deeply into his ascetic practice that at one point he knew he would die if he continued. And then he'd lose the chance for liberation, lose the chance to understand the answers to these dreadful questions that he had. Why do we experience old age, sickness, and death? What is life about? Why? And of course, he chose to go inward. And that is what each of us is really asked to do if we want to become free. Because I can tell you from my own experience and that of many others, that if we persist, if we keep swimming through that wet cement, if we keep going through the muck, as a Zen teacher friend of mine calls it, as we really struggle through the swamp of our history, of our assumptions, of our conditioning, there is a light at the end of the tunnel. We will emerge into a beautiful, peaceful place. But the bottom line is that we have to walk through it. We have to open to it, allow ourselves to experience radical acceptance. We don't have to like the feeling. But if we go into the sensations in our body, rather than in the story, and that's a struggle in itself, then we will gradually become free of being caught in stuff. This is the gift of the practice. As you've heard so many times, a friend of mine at the Rochester Zen Center, after having had a Kensho experience, after much struggle herself, said this practice is truly bodhisattvic. First, it shows us where we're caught, and then it sets us free. But in becoming free, we have to be willing to open to the pain, to the anguish, not necessarily to the experience, but to what it feels like in our body. Peter Levine discovered many times, many years past, that, and as Bessel van der Kolk, the leading researcher in trauma, also has said, these energies of shutting down are stuck in our bodies. And unless we allow them to rise and be felt, they stay stuck in our bodies, and they may be under the radar, but they're definitely pulling our strings, and we're behaving in ways driven by them that we don't even realize. Peter Levine was originally a wildlife biologist before he became a psychologist. And he recognized that animals, when they narrowly escape death, when the rabbit freezes, so whatever was chasing it is disinterested, because wild animals are not interested in dead food. I discovered that with my pet alligator. He would happily kill the goldfish that I bought for him with my allowance, but he would not eat anything. He would, if he was full after killing 3 of them, he would not eat the 4th one, but he'd kill it anyway. He only survived on hamburger that was force-fed by my brother with a very heavily gloved hand. But these animals that narrowly escaped death would, once the danger was over, they would shake. And that shaking would apparently process through whatever intense energy was built up in the attempt to escape. And so Peter Levine used this in his work with clients. He discovered this fairly early on and wrote about it in a book called Waking the Tiger. And he has since become a very prominent expert on working through trauma by tuning into the body. And you know that years ago, back in the early 80s, and this was a tremendous help to me, Eugene Gendlin, who was at the time a grad student, his thesis, I believe, was to discover what made the difference between people who moved easily, rapidly through their stuff in therapy versus those who could spend 5, 10, 20 years and come out with a nice intellectual understanding of what was going on for them, but no relief. And they discovered very quickly that the answer was in what he called the felt sense, which is going into your body and feeling the energy of this. It is a tremendous gift once you get a handle on it. And it's particularly effective in working with our stuff that comes up. If it comes up, and we don't search for it, by the way, but if it comes up, then that's how to work with it, to stay out of the story, because the story just creates more story and keeps us caught. But if we go into the feeling in our body, the sensations in our body, then there is a possibility of liberation from whatever that was that happened. And it's not necessarily instantaneous. It can take feeling it, and you feel it thoroughly enough, and this is a key, because you can be aware, for example, if you're angry, but you're not really feeling it, you're not feeling the energy of it in your body, and so you just know you're angry, that's all. It doesn't have any real significant effect. But if you go deeply enough in, and this takes practice, and try to feel what is going on in your body. What is your heart doing? Is there any kind of energy movement in your chest? Are your hands cold? And what's the quality of that cold? Are they just cold or are they icy? And what's going on, especially in your chest, where the vagal nerve is, which is a very important part of this puzzle. Then, gradually, you will be able to become free of whatever comes up. And the interesting thing is that Longchenpa, who was a 10th century Tibetan, highly realized master, discovered this or taught this back then. And in a book called You Are the Eyes of the World, which is a teisho in itself, just the name of that book, he speaks of when something comes up, when some feeling comes up, anger, lust, greed, whatever it is, that you tune into the energy of it at its first inception, and you rest fully in that energy. And within that resting, in the midst of that energy of whatever it is freed in its own place. And the result is a sense of peace and freedom right in the middle, and no need to act out. This is where we get into challenges with our emotions. We get angry, and our attempt to avoid feeling creates lashing out or stuffing it. Those are usually the two options. We yell, or we punch somebody, or we write a nasty letter, or we stuff it because we want to be a nice person. And everybody wants to be a nice person, and underneath it all, everybody is. It's just that things happen to us, and we don't know what to do with them. Our parents didn't know what to do with them. They just said, go to your room, or nobody's angry here, or don't cry, that's sissy, or whatever. And so you stuff it. because nobody tells you. Tune in. Feel the energy of that hurt. Feel the energy of that rage. Feel the energy of that sadness. And if you had done that, it would free you. There's a lot of increasingly effective information these days into what's known as attachment theory. And attachment is not the same as what we consider attachment in Buddhism, which is attachment to things, to a self-image, a sticky business. What's known as attachment theory in psychology has to do with how infants connect with their caregivers. And there are various ways they connect. The optimal way, of course, is what results in what is known as secure attachment, where the caregiver has been there pretty much most of the time for this child. And if the child is hurt, the caregiver runs and soothes, and in that teaches self-soothing to this infant. And then there's something that's insecure attachment. And in that case, sometimes the caregiver is there and sometimes the caregiver is not. And the child cannot count on anybody being there for them. And so the result is the child learns that the world cannot be trusted. People cannot be trusted. And there's a further assumption, and that is that if I was just good enough, people would care. People would take care of me. It's a pervasive thing, well known in psychology. So many of us coming to Zen practice carry these experiences with us, particularly those of insecure attachment. We may have had a parent that was just would fly off the handle for no understandable reason to a child. Or there are also cases where parents die, parents get divorced, where whatever happens, it happened in my own life with my younger son, who was 3 years old at the time we left to return to the States from living in Burma, where he had lived since he was 5 months old. And in Burma, they have a system of British nannies. It used to be a British colony at one point, and the British brought their whole culture, including baby nannies who took the child from the moment it was born, essentially, and gave it back when it went off to college. Or in the case of people living overseas, the kids were sent off to boarding school in England when they were 6 years old. So this nanny and Greg really, really bonded. We had hoped that they would bond with my husband and me. Our older son had, because he was already 2.5 and he had already bonded. So his experience was a bit different. But for Greg, the main caregiver was his nanny, whose name was Elsie. She was a Karen woman, quite a lovely, caring human being. And as we were preparing to return to the United States, there was no way we could possibly bring her with us. The salary for a Foreign Service officer in those days was less, it was half the poverty level. And we couldn't possibly support the plane ticket back to the United States or any kind of salary for her. It just was out of the picture. So for weeks before we left, we tried to prepare both the kids for the fact that we were leaving, and that Elsie, much as she would like to come with us, was not going to be able to. It just wasn't possible. And it wasn't until we got in the train, we were in the train in the station in Mandalay, and Elsie was outside and the train began to move, that Greg realized that Elsie was not coming. And he let out the most anguished cry that I burst into tears myself. And then, unfortunately, when we got back to the United States, I ended up in the hospital for a week. Turns out I had amoebic dysentery. And in those days, there was no child allowed in a hospital. My mother-in-law would bring both the kids to outside the hospital so they could wave at me through the window, but there were days when I couldn't get out of bed as well. When I got out of the hospital finally and went back home to my in-laws, Greg wouldn't speak to me. He would just follow me around the house and hit me. His anguish had to be profound, and it followed him through a good part of his life. How many of us have had experiences, maybe not with regard to Mandalay and amoebic dysentery, but with regard to some level of perceived abandonment, some level of perceived rejection? And again, these experiences will come to light, even if we've long forgotten them or stuffed them under the carpet some way. They will come to light in our zazen, and it is vital to work on them. A really, really good therapist, and these days there are more and more of them with excellent training, although there are still a lot of therapists who, one, are suspicious of Zen practice, and two, may not have the experience to work with people for whom things are coming up from the past. Although one would think that therapy would be such that the training would be adequate, but I know of cases where it's not. So if these things are coming up in your life, it's important to search out a therapist that you feel connected to, that you feel can help you move through these things and continue Zazen, because the combination of Zazen and therapy is dynamite. All of the Zen folks that I know who are therapists have said that anybody doing Zazen at the same time that they're doing therapy is going to move much more quickly through the therapy. And from a Zen teacher's perspective, also much more clearly and fast through the practice. Because as you work on these issues, it's like the way really opens up. There is a way out. And as Roshi Kapleau used to say, the way out is the way in, or the way in is the way out. And that is true. And it was certainly the case in my case, in my experience. But again, it's worth sticking it out. It's worth getting the right, effective help. It's worth not continuing to stuff it. It's worth opening up, dealing with the demons, because they can be dealt with when they come to light. They're more frightening when they're underground. And the most frightening thing is the assumptions we have made about ourselves as being unworthy. This happened to the Buddha as well. And he was challenged in that. As you know the story, as he finally decided he was going to have to go inward, he sat down and started working with his breath and tuning in and reaching within with this yearning to understand what life really was, to ultimately become free of birth and death, which he did ultimately become. And many, many Zen folks have also been able to do that. And the what is known as the Buddhist devil, Mara, and this is metaphorical for what is also known as devilish phenomena. And this can come up at different times in our practice. Mara came up first with this tantalizing vision of his beautiful daughters dancing provocatively in front of the Buddha, and that did not do a thing to him. He just kept going. It was more important for him to find his answers. And so that didn't work. So Mara got his demons to hurl boiling mud and lances and spears, which metaphorically is the pain that we can encounter sitting long hours in cross-legged positions. And is not necessary, by the way. We can change position, and we should periodically, unless we're so limber that no pain comes up. And I only know one person in all my years of Zen practice and Zen teaching who had that case, and his problem was sleepiness. In fact, he fell over backwards off the ton in Rochester one night doing yasa by falling asleep. And in Rochester, they sit facing the wall. Here, at least, if we fall asleep, we're going to bonk our head in the back on the wall, because we sit the Rinzai style facing into the room. That didn't work either. And finally, Mara pulled out his final ploy, which was, you can't do it. You just aren't worthy. And it is said that the Buddha touched the ground in just for affirmation that he was worthy, and that was the end of Mara's attempts to pull him off his practice. I struggled a lot with the unworthiness thing. That was my self-image. I wasn't good enough. I couldn't do it. And it was only because I needed to. It was the only way out that I persisted. And I'm saying all of this to all of you in hopes that anyone who has challenges in practice will persist, will get appropriate therapy help if needed. And when there's trauma involved, you really do need therapy. But our ordinary challenges with letting go is sufficient to cause a challenge in practice. And that's what we're called to do, is to let go this self-image, this collection of ideas, assumptions, based on the early childhood experiences and our continuing experiences. We develop a sense of self, an idea of who we are. And that sense of self requires protection, requires defense, and drives our personality and our interactions with people. It's a cause of suffering. It's a cause of doing things that we realize later we really didn't want to do, because people don't want to cause pain. And we do it unwittingly because we're still caught in our stuff. So Zen practice is really about what I call 360-degree practice. It's about leaving no stone uncovered in our work in going deeper and deeper and deeper and uncovering the amazing beingness that we are, because we are that. And again, I mention, we don't know when death will come, only that it will. It's hard to get excited about that when you're young, unless somebody close to you has died. But I don't want to scare people either. I mean, there's no point in that. But just recognize that life is finite as we understand it in layman's terms. It's infinite in reality. But we have to work to open to that recognition that it is infinite. And even then, still most precious. luminous transparency, no stuck places, the most utter freedom possible. And it is reached through ongoing, dedicated practice. No matter what you bring into the practice, just persist and be as open as possible and as committed as possible, because then it's going to work if you persist. Faith that you can, doubt that how you're normally seeing things is really the truth with a capital T, and persistence. Stubbornness, great stubbornness. That's all you need. And you'll get there. Have faith in that. And know that despite the early assumptions about practice that came with Zen to the United States, that it was a way to just experience profound peace. You know, you sit down and you're sitting on the cushion and peace arises. Well, for some people, perhaps. But for most people, it is interspersed with challenge. But the more challenge we meet and work with effectively, the greater the peace is. Freedom, the freedom that we can realize through the practice is beyond words, and you can experience it. Kensho gives us a taste, but then we have to continue from there and go deeper yet, and deeper yet from there as well. And then gradually it unfolds, and it's amazing, and you can do it. I thank you for listening. We'll stop now and recite the 4 vows.